As I've explained in my other commentaries, the second coming of Christ happened. The rapture of the church preceded it, and I think I've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Bible was written perfectly. All of those prophecies came true. Our big problem now when it comes to this is what happened after the rapture? What happened after the second coming of Christ? Because obviously with the rapture occurring 66 AD through 70 AD, whatever it was, I believe it was 66, it may have been fully fulfilled by 70 AD. There's all these little details which we can only cull from ancient Roman and Jewish historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius. But without actual Christian documentation, because there were no real Christians who were actually there, where do we go for our sources after that? What we know after the rapture and the second coming of Christ, 66 through 70 AD, 42 months, is that there were people left behind. We know from Eusebius, who writes in his church history, that based upon a revelation the Jews were given, which we can now refer to as the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 24, as well as the book of Revelation itself, they ran to Pella, which is in Turkey. Now, they ran there before Jerusalem was invaded. 66 AD. We know from Luke that this was the abomination of desolation when the armies, the Roman armies, the pagan armies were outside the walls of Jerusalem. All of this stuff was predicted long before they happened, and it was fulfilled. Now, those who were left behind were those Judaizers who did not believe that the Gentiles could be brought in. You had to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. And this was a major schism. That's what the whole Jerusalem Council was about. I believe that was 49 AD where it was all figured out, but they still refused. But what they ended up doing was they ended up worshiping another family member of Jesus, and that was James. Now, James was killed in 62 AD by the Jews themselves, and they chose to worship him. But following that, they also chose to worship other family members of Jesus. Jude, his family members, an uncle Clopas, I believe it was, and also Mary. Now, who is known for the worship of Mary and for dead saints? Catholicism. This is the introduction of Roman Catholicism, not in the Roman sense of the later centuries, especially with Constantine, but this is how it really all began. All the Christians disappeared. Anyone who was still alive at Christ's appearing would have been raptured. Anyone who was truly a Christian. But all the ones who weren't, all the ones who were backsliders, they all left. They're gone. Bye. See ya. You're over in Pella somewhere in Turkey. You've escaped the destruction, which was outlined in Matthew 24. So what happened from there? They started coming up with their own writings. We have fragments of them today. One's called the Gospel of the Hebrews, one's called the Gospel of the Ebionites, and one's called the Gospel of the Nazarenes. And in all of these ones, it gives allegiance to James in almost everything. It seems that there was some serious James worship going on by these people. And this led into strange doctrines for the future. But we also had another problem, and Paul warned us of them in the epistles, the Gnostics. The Gnostics were coming up with all these secret, fanciful, secret knowledge items. They say that Simon Magus was the founder of this. Is this true? I have no idea. The ancient sources don't tell us. But what we do have is a mysticism which seems very Greek or Egyptian that would have come into this. Sumerian, whatever it was very non-Jewish yet Jewish. It was a strange mixture. So you have these sects, you have Gnostics, you have Ebionites, you have Nazarenes, and you also have the I'm forgetting some of the other characters that were going on around that time. Basically, a lot of heretical teachings and writings were going on. Now, they would have found all of the classic writings because they've been passed down to us. And those are what we know as the New Testament today. The New Testament, beginning with the Gospel of Matthew, which was written between 31 and 38 AD. We know that for a fact. And also the very final epistle, which appears to have been 2 Peter, written around 64 AD. They had these writings, and they started building their own writings off them. Now, there's a famous one called, I believe it's pronounced the Didache, which is Didache, and this was basically a rules of the community. But part of those rules ended up in a document called the Epistle of Barnabas. Now there's arguments, and some are actually very good modern arguments, saying that part of the Epistle of Barnabas is a fake, but part of it's real from the real Barnabas, because Barnabas was, he was just a mortal man, a mortal Jew writing. He was a good early follower of Christ, a very important part, but his words weren't God-breathed like for Paul or James or Jude or John or Peter. I mean, it goes on, Mark, so on. So we're looking at these. So you have all these strange writings which are coming out after the fact. There's no Christians to refute these things. And then suddenly you end up later in the first century with an old Jewish writing, the Ascension and Martyrdom of Isaiah. Now, the Martyrdom of Isaiah was a very old work, but they added on to it. They added on in the middle of it a Christian section where they allude to Nero having been Antichrist, the beast. And this is one of those ones that popped up. You then have these later church authors like Clement and Ignatius, and they are commenting that the second coming hasn't even come. The Parousia has not shown up. So this is where a lot of the confusion starts, is in the end of the first century, in the beginning of the second century. You have Papias and all these other people, and they have no idea that the second coming has already happened. Well, of course they don't know it hasn't happened. They've been learning from these people who weren't raptured, who didn't experience the second coming of Christ in Jerusalem because they run off to Pella and to other areas. And then you start seeing these even weirder writings that start showing up in the second century. The Gospel of Peter, which gives us basically the first form of Dante's Inferno, as well as these strange additions to the Gospel. But it wasn't even written by Peter. It's a whole new writing. People are suddenly discovering, hey, you can make money off these Christians because they've got all these neat little interests in all these writings. You start getting into these, like, the Acts of the Apostles, like the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Barnabas, the Acts of, I believe one of them was to Thomas, so the Acts of Bartholomew. You start getting all these, and then you end up with this utterly crazy writing, the Gospel of James, which others know as the Infancy Gospel of James, where we get Mary worship. This is where suddenly she's the perpetual virgin the whole time, before, in the middle, and after Jesus' birth, even though the Bible lets us know that Joseph and her consummated after the pregnancy was fulfilled, after Jesus was born. So who are we going to believe? Are we going to believe the scriptures as they were written? Or are we going to believe later doctrines? See, all these doctrines showed up after the fact, after the rapture, after the Parousia. This is where we get Catholic writings. This is where we get all the weird offshoot cults that occurred. But this is primarily where Catholicism came from. It came from a primacy of worship towards family members of Jesus or dead saints, in particular Mary and James. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's biblically forbidden to pray to the dead. It is totally biblically forbidden. I mean, that little trip of Saul, King Saul, to Endor, the witch of Endor, should have completely cleared that up, let alone Luke 17, when we're being told that, oh boy, I'm already forgetting, when Lazarus was at the gate and the rich man couldn't even contact his family members because there's a gulf and a chasm where he can't get to see Lazarus across basically what I believe is the Tartarus is the name of this chasm. But if Moses and the prophet can't reach these family members of his to warn them about hell, then what good would somebody coming back from the dead? Hebrews, we are told that is appointed unto man once to die, and then the judgment. So there's all these crazy things that happen. After 70 AD is where all these offshoots, these basically cults, started popping up, and those have now landed in Catholic doctrine to this day. You see, there's no such thing as a denomination in the Bible when it comes to Christianity. You are either a Christian or you are not a Christian. So the fact that all these strange new teachings came in and they decide to follow these strange new teachings is why there's so much confusion today, and why there was a Protestant Reformation to get away from Catholicism. Because Catholicism has taken from these documents, pushed aside our scriptures, and said these later writings are the true writings. These are the traditions, the Didache, the Gospel of James, the epistles of Ignatius, the epistles of Papias, the few fragments that we have regarding that, the writings of his, which I believe were the sayings of the Lord. And then all of that was being poisoned by Gnosticism. So that's what happened after the rapture and the second coming of Christ. Sad, isn't it? But that is the absolute truth. Total chaos. We had scriptures left behind, but they just didn't want to believe that Jesus Christ was who he said he was, because they wanted him to be the conquering Jew instead of the Savior of mankind. Sad. Very sad.